Yes, I was there that Saturday afternoon in July. Thousands of people were gathered around the Pennsylvania Railroad workshops. Without warning, they were fired upon, and many killed or wounded. This caused universal indignation and was the reason for all the subsequent destruction.
It began as a railroad strike, but fueled by the nation's first great industrial depression, it became a nationwide rebellion. 80,000 railroad workers walked out. Hundreds of thousands of working people soon followed. Pitched battles left over 100 Americans dead, hundreds more wounded. The great uprising's intensity and scope shocked America. The railroad had placed the United States on the threshold of industrial supremacy. But by the summer of 1877, the railroad aroused bitter resistance. Something had gone terribly wrong. Philadelphia, 100 years after America declared its independence, its citizens flocked to the Centennial Exposition. Thousands gathered to mark the Republic's resilience following a bitter civil war. They came to admire the country's technological triumphs and celebrate its territorial expansion. At the center of this century of progress, the American railway system. The railroad had promised to unite the once divided nation and benefit all citizens. Chinese and Irish immigrants, as well as Civil War veterans, were set to work as the country enthusiastically committed itself to railroad construction.
When me and my mates get our sturdy sledgehammers going, we make a kind of grand anvil chorus across the plains. 3 strokes to a spike, 10 spikes to a rail. Let's see, I got it figured out. 400 rails to a mile, 1,800 miles to bloody San Francisco. And that makes, by my reckoning, some 20 million or so times we'll swing these sledges before this great work of modern America is done.
In 1869, the Golden Spike was finally hammered into place. The Transcontinental Railroad system unified America. The poet Walt Whitman sang its praises. Thy black cylindric body, golden brass and silver steel, type of the modern, emblem of motion and power, pulse of the continent. The railroad connected farmlands, towns, and cities. It moved goods, information, and people. In 10 short years, railroad mileage doubled. Federal and state governments sponsored railroad expansion, giving the railroads nearly 200 million acres of public land, as well as millions of dollars in loans and tax breaks. Railroad owners, notably New York Central President Cornelius Vanderbilt, amassed staggering wealth. His son William inherited $100 million upon Vanderbilt's death in 1877. In that year of severe economic depression, a decent day's wage was $1.50. Railroad owners' wealth translated into unimagined power. Tom Scott ran the Pennsylvania Railroad, the nation's largest business enterprise. From his Philadelphia headquarters, Scott controlled the lives of workers and communities across the country. He manipulated state and federal legislatures and even presidential elections. Such domination led Charles Francis Adams, son and grandson of presidents, to observe,
"The system of corporate life is a new power for which our language contains no name. We have no word to express government by moneyed corporations."
this wealth and power seemed to many Americans to transform the very structure of society and undermine their basic freedoms. In June, Scott, Vanderbilt, and other railroad executives secretly met. They agreed to cut their employees' wages, even as they announced substantial dividends for their stockholders. John Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, explained.
The great principle upon which we joined to act was to earn more and to spend less.
On July 15th, the B&O announced a 10% wage cut. Dick Zepp, a brakeman on the B&O line, decides this action is too much to take. On the hot, sultry afternoon of July 16th, Zepp steps down from his locomotive. He and his fellow workers stop trains in the Martinsburg, West Virginia rail yards.
No train's gonna move till we get a living wage.
We might as well starve without workers with us.
Here comes a damn militia.
Go home!
Stop that black! Don't let him throw the switch!
This is the spark that ignites the great uprising. Soon after, Scott's Pennsylvania Railroad announces its 10% wage cut. The company also fires half its brakemen, flagmen, and conductors. For those remaining, the workload doubles. Pittsburgh, a center for Pennsylvania Railroad traffic. Here, the cutbacks arouse immediate opposition.
You see, the Pennsylvania Railroad officials' overbearing manner and their refusal to compromise with their employees has been resented in the city for years amongst all classes of people. Even businessmen have been bitter enemies of the road.
Pittsburgh Railroad workers refuse to let trains move. Freight cars, many loaded with perishable goods, begin to pile up in the yard. The trainmen's union demands wage levels be restored and fired workers reinstated. Pennsylvania Railroad officials refuse to negotiate.
The strikers have asked for things we can't grant them at all. It isn't worthwhile discussing the matter. What they propose will take the railroad out of our hands.
All opposing this is jargon. It takes two to make a bargain. He who thinks his word should rule is a knave and eke a fool. One won't do. Two, sir, two. It takes two to make a bargain.
Sheriff Hugh Fife's police cannot disperse the growing crowd. Pittsburgh's state militia company is called out, but its largely working-class members refuse to confront the strikers. Philadelphia's militia company is dispatched instead. Meanwhile, in Baltimore, a clash between the Maryland militia and city residents leaves 11 working people dead and 40 wounded. Pittsburgh citizens hear this news as they await the arrival of the Philadelphia militia.
Wouldn't dare do it here.
Thousands of strikers and sympathizers, Irish, German, English, and American-born, jam the tracks. A strike leader warns the crowd.
The Philadelphia militia will come here as strangers, regarding you as we regarded the rebels during the Civil War. There will be no friendly feeling between you and them. For God's sake, stand back when they arrive.
600 Philadelphia militiamen reach Pittsburgh. The troops march out of the station, led by the Pennsylvania Railroad Superintendent and Sheriff Fife.
Get out of here. Go back to Philadelphia. I fought for the Republic.
The soldiers suddenly charged the crowd with their bayonets. Pittsburgh citizens are killed. Many more are wounded. The enraged crowd chases the Philadelphia militia into the railroad roundhouse. Railroad property is torched. When firemen try to save burning railroad buildings, their hoses are cut.
Stole by a damn monopoly! Let it burn!
The battle continues throughout the night. Members of the crowd set fire to freight cars and push them down the tracks toward the roundhouse. The Philadelphia troops flee the burning building.
Don't let him escape!
20 more Pittsburgh residents and 5 Philadelphia soldiers are killed before the militia can escape.
I am Colonel D.L. Smith, alderman for the city of Allegheny. Yes, I was there that Saturday afternoon in July. Thousands of people were gathered around the Pennsylvania Railroad workshops, and most of them weren't strikers. Their purpose for being there was not to violate any law. No, they either sympathized with the strikers or they were curious to witness the arrival of the Philadelphia militia. At least one half were women and children. Without warning, they were fired upon, and many killed or wounded. This caused universal indignation and was the reason for all the subsequent destruction.
With the routing of the Philadelphia militia, working people from all over the Pittsburgh region converge on the railroad yards. They loot the smoldering freight cars.
My father hasn't worked in many months. And so on Monday, he went to the rail yards where many people were helping themselves to such things as wine, hams, and barrels of flour.
Father, he tried to roll a barrel of flour up the hill, but he lost his hold and rolled down with the barrel, and he lay there unconscious till daylight. He was still dazed when he reached home Sunday morning.
The fire spreads for 3 miles. Over 40 Pennsylvania Railroad buildings, 100 locomotives, and 2,000 freight cars are destroyed. The actions of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Philadelphia militia were only the immediate cause of the destruction. Americans had not benefited equally from the country's economic growth. The nation was mired in the 4th year of a severe economic depression. Millions had lost their jobs. Those still working suffered wage cuts of as much as 50%. In some cities, 1 out of 3 workers was unemployed.
How do I live? I don't. My family gets meat once a week. And the rest of the time, there is nothing but dry bread and coffee. Black coffee. Death is staring us in the face. It is cruel to be compelled to starve in this plentiful world.
Many deplored the Depression's misery, but there was little agreement on remedies. Calls for public relief and work programs fell on deaf ears. An influential magazine editorialized,
"Free soup must be prohibited, and all classes must learn that soup of any kind, beef or turtle, can be had only by being paid for. Simply because one's stomach is empty is no reason to rail at the rich."
Thousands of unemployed workers wandered about the country.
"12 months ago, I started from Philadelphia in search of work. I was a mechanic, and a competent one at that. During this year, I've crossed 17 states and obtained only 6 weeks' work. Last winter, I slept in the woods. It had been 2 or 3 days without food. When in God's name I asked for something to keep body and soul together, I've been repulsed as a tramp and a vagabond."
With so many desperate people wandering about, the nation's press voiced fears of the tramp menace.
Dimes and dollars, dollars and dimes, and empty pockets, the worst of crimes. If a man is down, give him a thrust. Trample the beggar into the dust. Presumptuous poverty's quite appalling. Knock him over, kick him for falling.
The greatest victim of the Depression, the unemployed worker, was seen as its very cause. The employed worker did not have an easy time either.
Don't understand, they want to break us apart.
Many went out on strike to restore wage cuts, but most work stoppages failed. Businessmen were able to replace strikers with the unemployed. The railroads and other companies also used repressive tactics to break unions. The young labor movement was all but destroyed. Nevertheless, as news of Pittsburgh spreads, working class communities across the country react.
It was everywhere. It was nowhere. It was as if some central volcano had belched forth burning rivers in every direction.
Protests surge along the railroad lines, rapidly building into a nationwide strike wave. The Great Uprising enters its second week. Cumberland, Maryland. Railroad strikers are joined by canal boatmen. Hornellsville, New York. Strikers soap down the tracks, immobilizing trains. Scranton, Pennsylvania. Striking coal and iron workers are attacked by police and businessmen. A San Francisco strike meeting degenerates into an anti-Chinese riot. But in Louisville, Kentucky, black and white workers march together, demanding a wage increase. New York City, 20,000 citizens gather in support of the strike. Departing protesters are attacked by the police. Reading, Pennsylvania, 11 strikers are killed. St. Louis, the railroad stoppage escalates into a general strike. White and black workers shut down the city for 5 days. Pittsburgh, iron and steel workers, miners, and laborers join railroad strikers. Middle-class residents and workers form a citizens' patrol to restore calm to the city's streets. Meanwhile, the Trainmen's Union runs the railroad, directing the movement of passenger and mail trains. They refuse, however, to operate freight trains. Despite the work stoppages and the destruction of his train yards, Pennsylvania Railroad President Tom Scott still refuses to negotiate. With the strike intensifying, cities and towns report food shortages. President Rutherford B. Hayes decides to break the strike with federal troops. Troops he had removed a month earlier from the South, where they had been protecting the rights of recently freed slaves. Chicago. One day after the Pittsburgh rail yards are burned, The Workingmen's Party, the nation's first socialist party, calls a mass demonstration to support the strikers. "20,000 gathered that evening. Albert Parsons, a printer, addresses the crowd.
We are assembled as the grand army of starvation. We have come together to find the means by which the great gloom that now hangs over our republic can be lifted. It rests with you to say whether we shall allow the capitalists to go on exploiting us. Will you organize? We will! Then enroll your names in the grand army of labor.
The conflict in Chicago becomes a general strike. Led by jubilant brass bands, crowds of workers march through the city's industrial neighborhoods. They call on other workers to join the strike. One group, largely Czech laborers, marches to the giant McCormick Reaper Works.
Look out, Beeler!
Without warning, the Chicago police open fire. 2 strikers are killed. The Chicago Tribune endorses the new police policy.
The police are beginning to shoot lower. It would have been much better if the mayor had allowed this to be done yesterday. It was a day lost.
Running battles between police and strikers break out all over the city. Mayor Monroe Heath calls on the city's middle and upper class residents to form armed neighborhood patrols. Unlike Pittsburgh, where the strike united most residents against the railroad, the Chicago strike divides the city along class lines. On the 4th day of the Chicago strike, police fire into a crowd gathered near the Halsted Street Viaduct. As the battle shifts to the city's working-class neighborhoods, the number of casualties mounts. Wyans Novikowski, a 36-year-old blacksmith, is killed as he steps into the street. 17-year-old James Kelly is shot in the head while throwing stones at the police. Chicago authorities determine that any form of resistance will be suppressed. The police invade Turner Hall, where German cabinet makers are negotiating with their employers. German workers are clubbed and shot. By that night, 30 Chicago working people lie dead. Another 200 are wounded. There are no police fatalities. The strike in Chicago has been crushed. Across the country, strikes are brought to an end. Police and volunteer militia break the non-violent St. Louis general strike. U.S. Army troops enter cities and towns, securing railroad property. In Pittsburgh, soldiers seize control of the rail lines from the trainmen's union. Here and there, resistance continues, but after 2 weeks, the great uprising is over. Americans now have to account for the strike. In its aftermath, newspapers, magazines, and books shaped perceptions of the event.
What about France?
Melodrama was chosen over accuracy. Artists drew guns in strikers' hands in instances where none existed. Protesters were often depicted as animals. These accounts reinforced the opinions of national leaders who blamed the strikes and violence on tramps, the foreign-born, and communists.
What did labor by the war gain if only one makes the bargain, and the workmen must keep quiet or only be heard in riot? Bosses high and bosses low, you must all be taught to know one won't do. Two, sir, two. It takes two to make a bargain.
The immense economic and political power accumulated by the railroads, the first national corporations, created growing imbalances in the nation. Americans felt increasingly powerless, their basic rights and liberties violated. Did the concept of freedom now mean corporate leaders could use and protect their wealth in any way they saw fit? Alan Pinkerton, whose detective agency was employed by railroads, answered affirmatively.
All strikers were guilty of preventing the movement of trains. The act of stopping trains made the strike truly as riotous a proceeding as the pillage, arson, and murder that took place.
The Independent, a religious journal, offered a widely accepted solution for such chaos.
Bullets and bayonets, canister and grape shot constitute the one remedy and the one duty of the hour. Napoleon was right when he said that the way to deal with a mob is to exterminate it.
In the strike's aftermath, police powers were increased across the country. In major cities, new armories were constructed. Militia companies were reorganized and supplied with advanced weaponry. The preoccupation with military force only obscured the Great Uprising's significance. Samuel Gompers, a young cigar maker in 1877 and later president of the American Federation of Labor, concluded,
"The Railway Workers' Rebellion was a declaration of protest against conditions that nullified the rights of American citizens." The railroad strike of 1877 was the tocsin, the alarm bell that sounded a ringing message of hope to us all.
The Great Uprising signaled a new rift in American society. The issue of slave labor had previously torn the nation apart, but the goal of equality had not been fully achieved with the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. Industrial capitalism's growing power to impose harsh conditions of work and life divided the country once again. When working people stopped trains in 1877, they demanded that all Americans share in the benefits of industrial society. A new battle over the meaning of equality in America had begun.